So I want to talk just a little bit about Charlotte Perkins Gilman and the two pieces you had to read, why I wrote the Yellow Wallpaper and then her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. Here you can see a picture of her at her vocation that was very important to her as a female writer at this particular time period. I'm going to start with the last piece first because it's important for you to know that background. And in the previous video, I told you about her condition and Weir Mitchell, but here she specifically addresses what happened to her. And so this particular quote has to do specifically with what Weir Mitchell prescribed for her, which was the rest cure. And she said this, this wise man put me to bed and applied the rest cure, to which a still good physique responded so promptly that he concluded there was nothing much the matter with me, and sent me home with solemn advice to live as domestic a life as far as possible, to have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as I lived. So clearly stop writing, stop creating. He felt that this was causing her depression and her anxiety and her nervous condition. Well, she tried that for a while, as she states, and found out that she got worse. And so she eventually goes on to say, I cast the noted specialist's advice to the winds and went to work again. Work, the normal life of every human being. Work, in which joy and growth and service without which one is a pauper and a parasite, ultimately recovering some measure of power. So again, you see this dichotomy between this ideal woman who's supposed to do nothing but rest, and Gilman pushing back against that, saying no, it was the very work itself, the act of creativity, being involved with something that cured me. And then she ultimately ends with a response to many people who said that, this story drove them crazy. That it was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy. And it worked. And clearly, now that you've read the story, you see that it is about a woman's descent into madness, as she has been prescribed this rest cure. So I want to point out a couple of, actually a few passages from the short story, many of them at the very beginning, that sort of set the tone and the stage for what we're going to get here. And so it's interesting to me that Gilman begins the story making it very clear that they are, the people in the story are ordinary people. So these are not unusual people. They're not, this is a common everyday thing. It's what she was trying to drive home. And even their names are common. John, for example. And the narrator, the female narrator, doesn't really have a name. There's debate among scholars because of a mention in the last part of the story that her name may be Jane, but I tend to believe that on purpose Gilman gave her no name to establish her as an ordinary woman, in a sense that this could happen to any woman, and so be careful, don't let it happen to you, in other words. And then we get right at the beginning as well that there is something wrong with this house, that she is uneasy about it, and then later she calls it a haunted house. Right at the beginning she says there is definitely something queer about it. And then over on the next page she talks about the room that she's in, that it is a big airy room. There's windows that look all ways. There's air and there's sunshine galore. Then she goes on to say it was a nursery at first, and then a playroom and a gymnasium, which is just a place for kids to play. And then she said, I should judge, for the windows are barred for little children. So she is skeptical, nervous a little bit about this place. She describes the room that she's in as a place where children were, with bars on the windows. So clearly there's some trepidation from the initial passages in the story that where she isn't exactly going to be the best thing for her, and that she is considered to be in some ways as a child. And then at the beginning of the story we get a description of John that is very telling. And she starts with this line, John laughs at me. Of course, but one expects that in marriage. He has no patience with faith, an intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. John is a physician, and perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. You see, he does not believe I am sick. So we get this very significant description of John's attitude toward her at the beginning of the story, that she is not truly sick, that she is worthy to be laughed at. Later in the story he calls her a blessed little goose, and at one point his little girl. So she is infantilized at the outset of the story. Her condition is made to look not so serious, and basically this lack of recognition, the lack of treating her as an adult human being, is going to contribute to her madness. And then it's very interesting too that she shows her helplessness at the beginning of the story, where 3 different times in basically the same way she asks this question, what can one do? So in other words, she feels trapped, she feels misunderstood, she feels like a child, and so that's what we get at the beginning of the story, complete helplessness embodied in this particular character. Again, right at the beginning, and it's so neat to see how writers sometimes pack so much into the first couple of pages and then develop it throughout. So when you read short stories, pay particular attention to what comes initially. So anyway, another passage to point out at the very beginning is basically the conflict that we saw her articulate between where Mitchell and herself in real life. We see this being articulated between John and the narrator in the actual story, where John, or her condition is one in which she has been absolutely forbidden to work. And then she goes on to say, I disagree, that I believe that congenial work with excitement and change would do me good. So you see that articulated right at the beginning of the story as well. And then what we get as you read through the story is a description, periodic descriptions of the wallpaper. At first mention of the wallpaper, she talks about its patterns. She talks about how the color is repellent and revolting, and that she just hates it. As the story progresses, she gets more and more obsessed with the wallpaper, and the descriptions become more and more troublesome. At one point, she describes the paper as if it knew what a vicious influence it had. As we continue to read and the story develops, she begins to see a figure in the wallpaper. She sees a woman in it, And as it progresses, she sees that the woman is shaking the wallpaper, trying to get out of it. And then finally she says, I think that the woman gets out in the daytime. And I'll tell you why. Privately, I have seen her. So now we have an actual hallucination going on as this character descends farther and farther into madness. And then at the very, very end of the story, we get two very significant lines. One is that she wants to astonish John by freeing the woman for the wallpaper. And so astonish him she does, because as he walks in at the end of the story, he faints. So he finally recognizes how far into madness this woman has descended. And one of the last lines of the story is that I've got out at last. So in other words, she has become the woman in the wallpaper, and she has fought to free herself. Well, that freedom, so to speak, has come with her insanity. And so we get a very, very dire story here. And it's a picture that she specifically wants to paint, that if women are not allowed to pursue work and meaningful work, that it will not only keep them as children, which in some ways the culture wanted, as you remember we talked about the angel in the house, but it will lead to their madness. So, the question here is that there is, what is at stake? I think what is at stake is the society's attitude toward women and their appropriate roles. And so there's a lot going on here, and I think it's very telling that she does say, I want to astonish John. So she does do that, and in many ways this story shows just how hard the fight was for women in this time period. That the only way that those women that broke out of the traditional angel in the house role were considered crazy, and needed to be silenced. And so you really see Gilman pushing back against that, and showing us in a very horrific way what the result of that can be for women.